Hi, if you or your children are suffering because of your relationship with your ex-partner, because it's stressed or strained, or maybe they're just not a nice person, this show is for you. Welcome to the High Conflict Co-Parenting Podcast with Brooke Olson and Charlie Jewett. Enjoy another episode now. Hey everybody, Charlie Jewett, Brooke Olson, and actually Eric Schoberg again with the High Conflict Co-Parenting Podcast. This is episode 49. We're going to talk about, Eric, one of your favorite topics, right? Where you've sort of mastered this idea of the Rat Tangle. I hadn't heard of this before. I heard it from you a month or two ago and looked on the internet and saw some really cool pictures, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you give us an introduction, this terminology or analogy of the Rat Tangle. What is this and how do you use it?
Well, I think the place to start with it is the notion of family systems, and my introduction to really starting to get family systems was from a guy named John Bradshaw, who many years ago was a leader in the 12-step movement and all of that. And I was in Adult Children of Alcoholics and navigating that stuff. And he would speak about family systems in terms of a sailboat, like Sailboat Mobile. I don't know if you can see that there. Are you seeing that or no? Am I not sharing? There we go.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
And like the image that if something happens to one of the people in the family or one of the sailboats, the whole system will shift. So whether someone gets sicker or crazier or more aggressive or more submissive or whatever, it affects the others in the system. And so everyone's interconnected. And I was kind of like, this is really helpful for me to kind of understand the interconnectedness of the family system. And I kind of worked with that for years. And as I began my practice and began looking more and more closely at what this was, I began to see that this was not very accurate for my own family system, and nor was it for many of my clients. It was too nice. It was too pretty. And one day I came across this image.
There it is.
On the internet, which is often called a king rat. And it shows the interconnectedness of the family members in a really disgusting, horrific way. And that seemed to represent and have an impact on me. And as I shared it with clients, on them, where I didn't need to show it to them very often. Because it would be seared in their memories forever.
Mm-hmm. And I can attest to that, because when you introduced this one to me, it was like, okay, I got the image, and it went systemically into my being. And as we've worked together through these concepts, and I've done some of my own work in this image of that rat tangle that you introduced me to has been just an amazing help, because it is so intertwined, and there's kind of like this sense of no beginning and no ending to it. And how do you start to unravel that? And that's the place I think, that you've really worked so hard at parsing out.
Yeah, and really part of what the impact of the disgust of the image brings forth is this underlying naivete or blindness to the dysfunction that we came up in our family systems, and where that is, we're asleep, where we have been asleep. And this kind of touched on my many years of study of the Gurdjieff work, where he really worked with that notion that we are, man is asleep, and that part of our healing process is to recognize that we're asleep. And this image kind of pings that in a different way than Gurdjieff did. And where the image brings this prevalence of scarcity. Like in the Rat Tangle, there isn't enough love, there isn't enough space for sure, there isn't enough food or warmth or too much warmth, right? And it's just there isn't enough. And in the dysfunctional family systems that we come up in, that scarcity is fundamental. And where that scarcity creates in us a dumbing down, because we're in the hunger to get our needs met, and we're not really able to be as intelligent as we might be if we're getting enough. If we're getting enough love, if we're getting enough food, if we're getting enough attention. And where that dumbing down that scarcity brings in, and the impact of it and the drive to survival, because we get really locked in this tunnel vision of survival through that scarcity piece, and we do manipulation, we do domination, submission, we do all kinds of stuff out of that rat tangle.
And this piece that, you're talking about here, Eric, has a whole lot to do with everything that we bring into relationship, and how our relationships moving forward reflect this rat tangle that we're stuck in, and how we begin to recreate that dysfunction over and over again. And the place where, where you're talking about being asleep, that we're so unconscious of, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's so much unconsciousness that we're not aware of. Like by definition, we have all these blind spots. So the movement is into being aware that we're in this dysfunction. And we're aware that we're manipulating, we're dominating, we're submitting, we're trying to rescue, we're in some, intense codependence. And where that is really kind of an important perspective to get if we're going to cease doing our dysfunctional behaviors that we learned as kids in our family system. So another important perspective that I've kind of discovered in this is that we have the Rat Tangle family of origin, which is the first Rat Tangle. Then we escape, we leave home whenever we leave home, thinking that we've escaped that dysfunction, and the intensity and the pressure and the anxiety of it. But by the time we leave home, we've internalized it. And that's the second Rat Tangle. That's the internalized Rat Tangle. And we're not really aware that we have that. We're now doing what we learned in our family system. And then the third Rat Tangle shows up when we're in intimacy, in particular, in friendship, but more importantly in romantic intimacy, where our own Rat Tangle behaviors really amplify, and then they come into relationship with our partner's Rat Tangle they've now internalized. And each is projecting their Rat Tangle origin material on the other. And oftentimes that projection is already there. So we're projecting into the reality of the other person, or we project on them long enough and intensely enough that we actually evoke in them the behavior that we're used to having. And sometimes people are like, why am I doing this? I've never done this before. And sometimes that is from the partner projecting their Rat Tangle behavior onto them until they start doing it. And so that's the third one. And then the fourth one is kind of a meta perspective, which is more the legacy of it, where there are cultural pieces, it's like ancestors that were, annihilated or chased, the Jewish legacy traumas, or African Americans, or, there can be legacy traumas of child abuse that go back generations, where the parent perpetrates on the child becomes a parent and perpetrates, and on and on. So there's these 4 Rat Tangles that are really helpful to begin to look at more clearly.
Yeah, and the behaviors in all of those rat tangles that you're talking about are the control mechanisms, the survival mechanisms, the manipulation, the domination, the submission in both overt and covert capacities, and they kind of hide a lot, don't they?
Well, they're hidden in our very limited perspective of kind of being stuck in this illusion of scarcity and intense survival sometimes. And where what can happen is we can have a part of us that is stuck at 4 years old when whatever horrific trauma happened, but that part is acting out in us as an adult as though it were in that scene, but projecting the parent or the perpetrator onto the other person, onto the adult partner, and not realize that there's this dissociated flashback happening where a part of them is back in history, but a part of them is talking to their partner. And that level of blind spot there is really intense, and then creates a level of shame in that person because they're like, wow, I was just horrific to my partner, if they even recognize that. And then other patterns show up to try and hide the shame, and it just goes down the drain pretty quickly without awareness, without support.
So I want everybody just to tap on the brakes here for a moment, because what's just happened is a ton. And Eric has put a lot of stuff forward. And as I feel into this myself, it's like just listening to some of this stuff, it's real easy to get lost in. And I think that's indicative of the rat tangle in and of itself. To as you start to try to conceptualize what's being talked about here, it evokes those components in us, and we start to get a little bit entangled and lost in it. So I think it's important just to take a quick moment of breath before we move forward into that and just assimilate a little bit about what's being presented here.
Yeah, notice any impulse to listen to a different podcast or another YouTube channel or whatever's going on there, because this is intense. This is gnarly, uncomfortable stuff.
Again, I remember you bringing this stuff forward and just how easy it was for me to dissociate, because this really brings us into the apex, the bullseye zone of what's going on. And when we start to touch in those areas, I know for me, my stomach starts to move in a very uncomfortable way, and you and I have talked about this ad nauseum over the years. We've been in this conversation for 10 years or longer. And each time that we go in here, it's like, okay, let's slow this down just a little bit. There's a ton that's going on, and this is evocative of all of that. How about for you, Charlie? What's, as we're skipping through some of this, what are you noticing?
I mean, it's interesting. The image of their tails tied together, and then you talking about scarcity and dominance and submission and all that. The image is really helpful with that, because obviously we talk about childhood and what it was like, and that your parenting styles and all that and stuff affects you. But I mean, these rats are living a very different life than a rat that's free, right? free to roam and go find its own food. Imagine if your tails are all tied together like that, and you do stumble upon some food. It's like, well, who's going to eat it, or who's going to get to it first? And it's probably not very peaceful. It's probably sort of chaotic, right?
That's
and that
understanding day right there.
Yeah, and I mean, survival is problematic. People act out in very strange ways when a survival mechanism is triggered, right? And I suppose what the discovery is, it's much deeper than this, I'm sure, but one of the most basic parts of this discovery is, if you don't notice that you're living in survival mode, you're going to hurt yourself and hurt a lot of people and not accomplish much. And that awareness is sort of the beginning. Like, okay,
Right.
I'm either in a rat tangle or still living like I am because I was. So if you freed one of these rats and its tail wasn't tied and it still hung around the same 7 other rats and never ventured out and acted as if it was bound, kind of the story of the elephant, you tie a chain to its leg and eventually you can have a little string around it that it could easily break, but it just won't go away, you know? Somebody could be free and still acting like it, or actually entangled, and those might be 2 different types of work, but they're both very important if we're wanting to have people living out in freedom, right?
Yeah, I think the underlying energetic or psychology of what we're talking about here is something we've spoken about, I think, in previous conversations, of talking about duality and black and white thinking, which really sources from survival, where survival is, I'm going to live or I'm going to die, and I have to be in panic and urgency to try and get my needs met, which can, just check your mind's image of the rat tangle and recognize that these rats are in, the rats in the image are dead, but while they're alive, they're in a lot of urgency and panic and duality, and where that duality is not it's not reality. It's unavailable when they're in that kind of survival mechanism to see the nuance that's in between black and white, to see the color, to see the gray zones, and to work within those components is really difficult.
Yeah.
And to recognize that, like, that's really, as I've worked with this in myself and with clients over the years, one of the things that I've noticed is that when we have a recognition of something here, the first impulse is to jump out of the rat tangle, or to try to jump out of it, take action to try and leave it. And inevitably that doesn't work in the long run until we have enough awakening within the rat tangle and to look at what's going on. Where am I in, this pattern or that pattern, or where am I responding to the other person's pattern by going into one of my patterns? And the kind of, the image is really about waking up in the rat tangle that we're already in. So it's, there's a level of challenge to that most people don't like.
Yeah. Right. And in that duality of this feels good, this doesn't feel good, I want out of this, is this notion, when you and I have done work around some of this, Eric, that as we start to feel ourselves pull out, to jump out of that or try to avoid that sense that this is uncomfortable as we go into this arena, the words that come to my mind that I've heard you use so frequently is, so as you experience that, can you steer into that and hang out with this enough to really get a sense of what's here, right?
Yeah, and really also that notion of steering into what I'm seeing then has this next layer component of, like what you've been suggested a minute ago, of like, let's slow this down. In order to do this work and be with this, the gnarliness and intensity of whatever our particular rectangle is, we need to be able to turn the volume down, the intensity down, while still staying in it. And how to do that, how to be able to turn it down without turning it so far down that we're like, what's on YouTube, or whatever our, numbing behavior is that we can access through lack of stimulation as much as through too much stimulation. So how do we find that sweet spot in the middle of being able to be present with it and but not overwhelmed by it. The steering in has nuance.
Mm.
You know, the good news is we have thumbs. Rats don't, or whatever they have. So the realization that you're in a rat tangle, that holy cow, I'm a human. I have eyes and thumbs. I can see this thing and do something about it, is
Right.
powerful, right? Like rats have a little. Your tails are all tied together. There's not that much to do there, right? So,
Right.
Except
Well,
except chew on each other and get
yeah,
deeper into it, right?
right. And I'm sure there's some marriages where they're like, let's willingly tie our tails together and then spaz out and chew on each other and be upset about it, right? But we're more than that.
yeah. So we have cerebral cortex. We have brain structures that bats don't have, where we can think and where we can have self-awareness and where we can do all of that. But the problem is that when we're in duality, we go into tunnel vision and we don't have access to all of that.
Yep.
And so that initial transition is kind of where the rubber meets the road in this whole process. And it's the awakening in that is going to be a little different for every person. The general gist of it is, I believe, includes being able to tolerate what it is we're seeing, which also includes not taking on too much too fast, because we'll just tip.
Yeah.
So part of what we're talking about here, Eric, I think, is coming into access of that higher brain function, that cerebral piece, and being aware that so much of what we're doing is that survival piece, that fight, flight, freeze, that amygdala response of our world. And then finding a way to turn on that higher brain function and beginning to engage differently from there.
Right. And how to do that and how to kind of recognize what stage we're in is another piece to the puzzle. So, you and I have been somatic experiencing practitioners for 12 or 15 years or whatever it's been now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that Peter Levine spoke of in that and taught us is this notion of freeze. And if we're in freeze, we're in dissociation. We're in total, there's a physiological expression of immobility of awareness or movement or agency or, which shows up as depression or, impulsivity and not really being present. So that is usually the most intense form of the physiology of trauma, even though it doesn't look like that much. It's there's not a lot going on if you just look at the person when they're in freeze. The next one is this movement into duality, which is progress, and where that duality is a mobilization. We're moving into fight or flight. So our systems are trying to fight the other rats, the other family system, or we're trying to run, which requires mobility, requires some level of agency. And where that is a cool piece to the puzzle to kind of work at that threshold of moving into that. Does that make sense?
It does, and it just seems as though even within that duality, there's a lack of, to a great extent, of consciousness in terms of what's going on. It's more in the rat tangle, but it has some mobility to it.
Right.
But it's still pretty unconscious.
It's still pretty unconscious. So, yeah, there's layers and layers of this that we can play in. Let me pull something up here. So, that movement of duality has kind of different layers. There's the movement out of freeze into this awareness of feeling like you're utterly alone. Like, oh my God, I'm bereft. I'm in this deep loneliness. And where that duality has this manifestation that can move into numbing behaviors, which is a little different than the freeze behaviors. There's an intentionality to the numbing behaviors, which in internal family systems, we talk about firefighter parts. Those can be a component of fight or flight, like that, like burst of reactive energy can show up as a firefighter, but this other component of it, of really numbing it with alcohol or drugs or sex or work or busyness, any list of those.
Anything that we can do so we don't feel.
Right.
And
so in particular, that we don't feel the pain of being utterly alone, or the part that is feeling like it's utterly alone.
So in the context of the work that I do in this, this is the place where a lot of people get hung up, in the separation, in where these firefighter parts come up, where the fight comes up, where the numbingness comes up, where this duality comes up in the conflict. And what I really try to do, because of what you pointed me to in this Rat Tango conversation, is to get people really to start to look at the origins in their own family system of where this stuff comes out. Because what they're doing is they're replicating that in this piece, that idea, that notion that you just said of being alone in this, I think is one of the existential pieces when people are breaking up, when relationship is going to the hell in a handcart, if you will, that they get lost in, and their numbing happens through whatever means it is, whether it's withdrawal from society, whether it's eating, whether it's sugar, whether it's over-exercising, whether it's overworking, whatever that firefighter part that's up is really engaged, and it takes them away from the process of being able to really move through the process of what's needed here.
Right. And I think the other piece that you run into with your clients in the high conflict arena, which is something we all run into all the place, is this next layer of protector parts. There's kind of two layers in the IFS model of protector parts. There's the firefighters that we just spoke of, and then there's the manager parts. And the manager parts are the controlling ones. And those are the ones that actually have had a table scrap or two of getting their needs met. Like they get just a little bit of it, so they're like, oh, I want that. And so they go into controlling behaviors. Obsessive compulsive behavior, or trying to control their partner, not let them do this or make them do that. And where that has a whole nother component of conflict that can show up, or collapse, or submission. And it just gets really uncomfortable in a way that is pretty distinct from the firefighter. Now, you can have one partner using numbing behaviors and the other one trying to control them to get them to stop doing that. So one is in a firefighter, one's in a manager part, and they may flip in other arenas of their life. Like one may be addicted to exercise, one may be addicted to alcohol. And they're each trying to control each other, and they're each trying to numb themselves. It's a mess. It's a rat tangle. Yeah. We should have done this at beer time so we could be drinking all the time.
Right. I can't relate to anything that you're talking about.
Hey, when's
I
beer
know
time?
that you're not speaking out of experience at all, Eric. And
right.
Is there a certain time for beer?
Well, I'm trying to hack my sleep these days, and there's a book on it called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and he talks about the effects of alcohol on your sleep. And he's like, alcohol's fine as long as you have it for breakfast.
Which is what we've always been told is the wrong thing, right?
That's right.
You don't ever drink before noon.
Right.
cool. So there's a piece in this, you know, that we've been talking about, the fight, flight, freeze components, and what I'd like to steer into is a little bit of how that relates to attachment, how we kind of got here in the first place, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So healthy attachment and the traumas, if you will, that come from unhealthy attachment are a bit distinct, at least theoretically, from shock traumas of violence and abuse and those kind of things, in that they show up a little differently. For instance, like it can be helpful to just talk about what is attachment and what is love. Like I have a poster that I made somewhere that Facets of Love is the name of it, and there's a big heart, and it's black in the background, and the background is labeled as safety. Because if we don't have safety, which is the shock trauma piece, then we can't really take in the nourishment from love, from attachment. And then within the heart, there are a number of words. There's attunement, affection, appreciation, allowing, attention, and play. And each of these kind of holds a different facet of what attachment can mean, which is a definition more of what love is rather than what the poets have been talking about. We actually have some discernible components of it. And when we don't get the safety so that allows it, which could be the combination of shock trauma and attachment trauma, or if we don't have this shock trauma, like maybe there is safety or perceived safety, but there isn't the, there isn't an abundance of attunement, affection, appreciation, attention, play. And those lacks then create this scarcity that I was mentioning before. And the scarcity, where we're hungering for attention, could mean that we then become really manipulative to get attention. We become narcissistic personality disorder or some components of that. Or we could also become, borderline behaviors where we're clinging and we're trying to control the other person to try and get that, whatever facets of love that we're trying to get.
Yeah. So in the context of our podcast, for the most part, I talk about this piece of the importance for parents, adults, to be able to understand this, to get these concepts that you're talking about, Eric, around attachment and around trauma that comes out of these components, but also the descriptive components that you just gave of what love is. There's a descriptor of the components that go into the safety of being held, that is secure attachment, if you will. And how, as adults, we have to understand this and do this healing for ourselves to really dig into these concepts and these components so we can understand how we can break this patterning, break out of these rat tangles, and begin to have an environment for our children to develop in that don't have these components that we've internalized and brought forward. Because if we don't do that, if as you're listening to these podcasts, you don't take the time and the effort and the self-healing to do this, this is the legacy that we push forward.
Well, and there's nuances to that, where it becomes, there's a pendulum swinging that can happen. So I know I have several friends and clients who have suffered as children in some way or other from really strict, controlling parents, or just really controlling and manipulative, maybe not even strict, just weird and controlling, who then, when they had kids, became really permissive because they didn't want to pass on that, the pain that they felt from having their parents be really controlling. So they became the opposite. They moved into being really permissive, which created then, these really out of control kids. And when they would be with those kids that were out of control, they would feel good because they're like, oh, good, I'm, my kid is running around the grocery store doing crazy stuff. And I'm not, slapping them upside the head and, grounding them for 6 months or whatever.
Right.
And they feel good about that. Whereas the kid is really unbridled and not learning how to have their own sense of self and their own sense of self-discipline and power, which leads them into, teenage land that is untenable for everyone. Or the whole thing can be flipped in the other direction. Parents that are too permissive lead to parenting that is too strict. And the pendulum can just switch. It can just flip-flop through the generations. And it's kind of a mess.
And what we talk about a lot is, the parenting styles that we have and where that midpoint is. What you're talking about is authoritative parenting or authoritarian parenting and permissive parenting. And the sweet spot in this, the place of health in this is more of the authoritative model, that Dreiker's model of boundaries and discipline through consequence and agreement, win-win, and coming into that. But it's hard to do when you haven't had that piece given to you. It's a express learning of or unlearning of these other parenting styles, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a deeper expression in here of how do we discover who we are ourselves in a healthy way, and what are the components of a healthy self that we can then model and transmit and teach to our children. And the notion of that I've been playing with for years now is that these facets of self are being present and being present in reality, being present in the Rat Tangle of our history, or being present in the Rat Tangle that we're in right now, picking up there. The second is power, because if we can have healthy power, which is not the same as unhealthy power that's really dominating and authoritarian, like you said, but healthy power that has presence, and it also can have this third component, which is love. So power, love, and presence together synergize into this sense of self that we can embody, and in particular through embodying those three facets in our own internal lives and modeling it with our partner and modeling it with our children. Like, that is where we can really evolve in a way that isn't so much theoretical. Maybe there's a component of it, but it's really an expression of a state that is inside. Like, when I'm really fully awake and fully myself, I have power, love, and presence. If I'm kind of wondering how I'm doing and I go in and scan inside and I'm lacking one of those three, if I'm not feeling very present, or I'm feeling kind of submissive or weak, I'm probably not fully in myself. And that's what I need to kind of tune up a little bit, rather than try and make someone else outside of me change and submit to what it is that I'm lacking.
And isn't that a little bit of coming into relationship with the internal rat tangle, the components, those parts internally that are out of sync?
Right, just being present to that. That's the presence component of seeing where my shadow is. And you know, in the IFS, we have parts and we have self. And the goal is to unblend from the parts so that we can be with the parts, rather than be blended with them, trying to act out whatever place and time that they're stuck in. we can be with them and acknowledge that they're having a hard time and maybe speak for them with, as is appropriate, or ask them to step back a bit and then tend to them later when we have the time and bandwidth, and maybe with our therapist or IFS practitioner or whatever's going on, we can be in relationship with those parts rather than be blended with them and trying to do shit from it.
Kind of reparenting ourselves.
That's right.
So Charlie, you're sitting there kind of going blurry-eyed.
Yeah. No, not blurry-eyed.
What's happening here? What are you experiencing in this from this component?
Well, I definitely relate to the pendulum of strictness and permissiveness, although it was a little bit more in my past marriage versus like how my parents were and how I'm parenting, a little bit more like the other parent was so strict and controlling, that it made me want to go the other direction. Feel like, well, these kids will never be able to do anything if we don't, go do it this way. So I can see some of that pendulum, Eric, for sure. And can imagine that swinging through the generations, right? Kind of a momentum of like, don't do it this way. And then you go too far the other direction. Yeah. And I always love when you guys talk about parts, just because I'd never heard that before we first interviewed Eric, and it's so eye-opening. Imagine, Eric, when you first started, you maybe had that same experience, like, oh my gosh, that makes sense, right? That's a really, really useful way of looking at things, and it's brought a lot of peace to me. That's just different language. You don't hear that out there. You know what I mean? You kind of hear like, because of your childhood, here's how you are, right? Not...
Well, and even deeper than that is we have the culture, Western culture, not so much Eastern culture, but Western culture really sits on this foundational notion that we are one person. And we might have, parts that are fragmented off of that one person, that our healing process is to kind of reclaim them and integrate them.
Yeah.
And some parts models work in that notion. Whereas the IFS model, the notion is really built on the premise that we are many parts. We have many beings in us. And some of them are really young, some of them are, not as young, and some are, really holding a lot of pain and trauma. And the process of healing is around unburdening those parts, coming into relationship with them, coming into awareness with them. And what I find is, even at the very beginning of session work with people, that when they can kind of come into relationship with a part and unblend from it and go, oh, that's a part of me that is feeling really enraged and has these tantrums. It's not all of me. And I have another part of me that judges that part of me that has rage. And that's not all of me either.
Yeah.
And that unblending with these parts just has this profound settling for people, even in early sessions, first session often.
Right.
Like, oh my God, that's not all of me.
Right. That's the part that's jumping out at me, is that inside of our emotions and our psyche, to say I shouldn't be this way and I still am is very negative and sort of judgmental. And it's not positive or forward moving in any way, but to say there's a part of me that wants to throw a tantrum, or a part of me that doesn't want to disengage, if we're using sort of the high conflict language, and I'm going to ask that part to step back for a moment. All that is like negotiative and like positive and forward moving and peaceful. It, like, the good or bad is the very dualistic piece. Like, I'm a bad person because I XYZ, versus, man, some of what I went through, there's a part of me that the natural reaction is spaz out or whatever, right? Let me talk to that part right now and say, I understand you want to spaz out, and I would too. Right. Going through what you've been through, that's exactly probably what you should feel and do in protection mode. But the rest of us here have got your back, and hold on to that for a moment. Let's try something first, Right.
And what you're doing, Charlie, is exactly in the wheelhouse of IFS, of having compassion for our parts.
Mm-hmm.
And really this underlying theme of IFS is all parts are welcome, all of them. And I work with people that have some pretty scary parts, you know, parts that have had rage and hurt people, or, you know, that have been sexual predators, and where they have so much shame and so much self-judgment and so much, you know, dissociation and inability to integrate that, and the unblending from these parts, and like the acceptance of them and passion, and like, yeah, I get that, is so beautiful to watch. And so many people that I work with have never had anyone really get them in those places.
Yep.
And what then happens is they get themselves in that place, which is really what is necessary, because I'm only there for an hour or two or three, you know, and they're there with their own parts all the time.
Yep.
And this notion of you're the one that you've been waiting for.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. That's beautiful. Yeah, these pieces, you know, moving from the Rat Tango conversation into the IFS conversation, because these are all parts that are blended in the Rat Tangle, and then, you know, being able to start to identify those parts and loosen the knot and beginning to unblend the components so we can move into self-love and to self-compassion, and to start to begin to be the adult in the room, to take care of these components, to give them what they need so they can settle, to start to work with them, starts to, at least from my own experience, give me the components to work exteriorly with my relationships, and those components in my partner, in my friend, in my grandson, in my whatever that relationship is, becomes interrelated internally and externally. And again, this work that you've brought forward, and I found in a lot of these components in my personal work, have given me those tools. And what I want to have the people in this podcast here is, we don't make external change until we make internal change. And if we do something as an overlay, it doesn't stick, because this other stuff comes out and it starts to reenact itself. And I was talking to some people in the class last night, and Charlie and I actually talked about it a little bit in our last podcast, about the work that's required here. If we want to change the world, if we want to change the expression in our progeny, if we want to do these changes, it doesn't come as a pill, it doesn't come as a wish, it doesn't come without discomfort. We have to be willing to sit in this stuff, to steer into it, using your words, Eric, and to work with this so we can facilitate the consciousness that has to come to be able to make the changes.
Right. Oh, that's beautiful. And within that, learning to look for the signs that I am not in self-awareness, not in self-energy, like urgency, or, you know, trying to get someone else to change when I'm still doing my own thing, you know, still doing my Rat Tango behavior. Right. To begin to look for and deepen over time where my patterns are there, so that I can kind of catch myself and do then what my self-soothing, my self-awareness, like what is my awakening process that comes from wrestling with that and becoming more aware of that.
Nice.
And being willing, just being willing to not feel good.
Right. And I think one of the things, and I've said this a couple times already, and I want to keep reiterating, is that being willing will increase as we gain confidence at our ability to turn the volume of intensity down. Right. And what's really amazing in IFS, like, Dick Schwartz, I've watched him with people that are just lit up, and have, ask them, like, hey, why don't you turn the intensity down on that? And the first time I saw that, I was like, wait, how did that part agree to turn the intensity down? But it does. And I've since then done it many, many times, where you can just ask that part to, like, hey, can you just turn the volume down? I'm not going anywhere. I just want you to talk to me or communicate to me whatever feelings you're showing me in a way that isn't going to overwhelm me, so that I can really be there for you and hang out with you. Love you.
And that's so much more effective, because what would they do, Brooke, in a courtroom or anywhere else, if you turned up the intensity? They'd be like, listen, don't raise your voice to me, pal, or there's no reason to use foul language, or basically it's just immediate judgment. Don't do that. You shouldn't be like that.
Right. And again, this internal-external relationship that's taking place is when we are with other externally. And as Eric was saying, we can see the affect, we can see this piece start to generate up. If we can have that internal conversation with that part, then we can reflectively bring down the volume externally and be in relationship both internally and externally simultaneously in a way to be able to really affect change in the relationship.
And I bet you, Eric, you can tell me if this has been your experience. I bet you if you use this language with someone who's never heard any of it, they still would get it. So if somebody's getting out of control and you just said that part of you, right, that feels that way and that has all that pain and that right, that wants to be like that, we'll set that part aside just for a minute and let's have a conversation. And they'd never heard any of the language. I think they'd probably still get it.
Sometimes, I mean, it can, the asking the part to step back and pull its energy out of you is one of the phrases that I like to use that I got from Dick Schwartz. And where that part will listen, especially as it gets the hang that you're going to come back and talk to it in a time when it's not, when your partner's not yelling at you or whatever. Like, you can be like, the part of you that wants to come back swinging or wants to just shut down, you can ask it like, hey, can you just step back a little bit? And I'm going to come back and talk to you later. And we'll hang out and, we'll do a session with it, or we'll journal about it, or we'll go sit at the beach with it, or whatever works for you in that situation. Then those parts will learn more and more to trust you when you ask it to step back.
Interesting. Yeah.
So this seems like a this seems like a good place to take a pause. We've spent an hour in this. We've really come deep into a lot of stuff, and I want to come back to this conversation again. I want to do another podcast and get deeper into some of the ideas of what the experience is inside the Rat Tango, and get into the feel and the dysfunctional of the intimacy and some of these other topics that we've got in here. But I'd like to end this one at this point and offer that we will come back to this. And I want to thank you, Eric, for again taking the time in this to do it, and also in this conversation right here as we're ending. I've done personally a ton of work with Eric in this arena, and we have conversations about this all of the time. And I bring some of these concepts into teaching what I teach, but I want to offer Eric's expertise in this area as a resource for you guys if you want to do a lot of deeper work and step in and really start to get a handle on this, to reach out and contact him, to tap into his knowledge in these areas about working with self in these arenas. And because he's amazing in this. And you can get in touch with him by doing what, Eric?
Probably best is to go to my website, check my website out. It's ericsjoberg.com, ERICSJOBERG.com.
Okay. Anything that you want to conclude with here, Charlie?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Eric, for being here. It's always awesome to listen and learn from what you've experienced and the things that you've studied.
Thank you both for having me yet again.
All right. So that's the end of episode 49, Rat Tango with Eric Sjoberg. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time around.
Brooke, people don't have to wait until Friday mornings to get more content. If this is something that's helpful for them, right? This isn't the first time you've broadcast anything or recorded anything or put anything out there in the world. What are the other ways people can get the help more aggressively or speed up their recovery process? What materials are available for people right now?
Well, I've written a book called The Black Hole of High Conflict, and it's available on Amazon and Kindle. And everything that we're talking about is really compressed and put into there. So this is a really good starter place to get in and get your mind working and to see what these concepts are about and how to start to apply them. The other place that I think that is valuable is to go to our website and look at some of the blog articles that I've written. Those are available there as well. They go into some of these other arenas, and that's at www.highconflict.net. So the book, the website are also really good places to get the material. And also we have classes. We have high conflict diversion program classes that you can get into and get some one-on-one help with this as well.
And you know me, I'm aggressive. Whatever I want to become good at or learn, I find someone who's good at it and pay them and hire them and shorten my learning curve. What if somebody just wants your help? Somebody says, Brooke has this information. He's good at something I'm not good at yet, and I want to work with him. Do you have any type of coaching or consultations or anything like that?
Absolutely. I do one-on-one coaching for custody cases. I help people get ready for family court services. If you've got that in your community, I work with attorneys and clients to help them with managing and strategically setting them up to have more successful cases as well.
And how do they reach out? You want them to just go to the website or email or phone, or what's the best way for them to reach out, raise their hand and say, I need some help? They
can email me. My direct email is brooke@highconflict.net. That's BROOK at highconflict, HIGH, conflict.net.
Perfect. That's everything everybody would need to get some help, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Brooke.